No, you're not crazy. There is a lot of Mormon true crime. And today we're going to be talking about the Kaneko family. And this family is arguably the reason that the police knew what to do when a woman named Laura Daybell would come to town. Now, I like to tell these stories in the podcast, at least, in a way that's safe for the Mormons, verifiable enough for the ex-Mormons, and compelling enough for the never-Mormons. If you want to hear more stories like this, will you commit to like, rate, review, and subscribe on your platform of choice to make the mayor of Kolob happy? Thank you. If you're going to listen to one Mormon true crime, this should be the one. I say that because this is the story that actually got me into Mormon true crime as a believing member at BYU, Idaho in 2007, when the detective on the case came and told us about it in my sociology class. This story is why Mormon true crime exists. So this story actually begins 25 years before the Daybells. It was Rexburg in 1994. And, well, a few years later in 2004, at the grocery store clerk saw the same man come up to her that she had seen every Friday night for quite some time, making the same purchase he made every single week. And if she had known what he was buying those for, she would have called the police ages ago. So let's go back in time to 1994. And we're going to meet the Kaneko family. The Kanekos were a Japanese-American family that lived in Rexburg, Idaho, which is kind of unusual because the vast majority of Mormons are white. So you can actually check out this story and hear from the family that was impacted by it on Oxygen's Accident, Suicide, or Murder. And in that episode, Lorraine, we have the Kaneko family. David is the dad, Lorraine is the mom, and Laura is the 24-year-old daughter in this story. So Lorraine's brothers in Accident, Suicide, or Murder, they ended up saying that David had been the bishop of his ward when he started to have some strange visions. Now, for those of you who are never Mormons, a bishop is somebody who is over a congregation, and a ward is that congregation, just the Mormon speak. So David starts having visions about the end of the world, about doomsday apocalyptic times, and he ends up starting to tell his ward about that. Now, headquarters in Salt Lake, they were not thrilled about the fact that Bishop Kaneko was saying this. They were very not thrilled with the fact that he was saying, don't listen to the prophet. The prophet is going to be leading you astray. The end of the world is coming. I need you to listen to me. And so he was released from his calling. His wife, Lorraine, was released from her calling. And their daughter, Laura, was released from her callings. And it's at this point that the Kanekos decided to go into seclusion. Now, they went into seclusion in their home in a trailer that it's across from where Artco is, for those of you who are familiar with Rexburg, at Stationery Place. It's across the street from where that is. There's some businesses there now. Now, I point this out because it is exactly 7 minutes, a direct straight shot south of where Chad Daybell's home was. So we're 25 years and 7 minutes apart from when the Daybell case would happen. So they go into seclusion in their house and they stop talking to people out in the community. And Laura, the 24-year-old daughter, she went to go see her grandmother, who lived on the same piece of property in a separate home from her and her parents. Her grandmother, her name was Marie, and Marie would tell her, like, hey, Laura, wouldn't it be so fun if you went on an LDS mission and maybe you would get called to Japan and then you could, like, learn to speak Japanese, and it would be, a way to connect with your heritage and your culture. Laura thought that sounded like a really cool, really fun idea. And so Laura, she went home and she said to her parents, guys, Grandma had this really cool idea. And, well, David, who is saying that he's having lots of visions about the end of the world, he thinks this is a terrible idea. So David and Lorraine go over to Marie's house. Marie is Lorraine's mother. And they say to Marie, mind your own damn business. We don't want you putting any crazy ideas into Laura's head. And so we want you to just never talk to her again. It's at this point that Lorraine and Laura went into that trailer and they would never come out again. Now, I promise you that this has lots of twists and turns. This is not what you're thinking. And so bear with me. Stick this one out. So Lorraine and Laura, they go into the trailer. They never come out. But David would continue to go to his job at Idaho National Laboratories, where he worked at the Naval Reactor Facility. And he actually had top civilian security clearance as part of his job. He was a highly educated man. He had a bachelor's and a master's in biology from Brigham Young University, Idaho in Provo, Utah, as well as a master's in zoology, also from BYU. Lorraine, his wife, they met at BYU when she was pursuing a degree for teaching. She did teach for a while she was helping David get through school. Lorraine also had been the valedictorian at Madison High School in Rexburg, Idaho. And years later, their daughter Laura would also be the valedictorian. But David did not let her speak at her graduation, even though she had earned that right. She was highly involved in clubs. She was the Relief Society president, which means she was over the women's organization in her ward at Ricks College 2 different semesters. So they were extremely involved in the Mormon church, and they were extremely involved in their community. So when they went into seclusion, that was something that nobody would have expected. Now, 10 years would pass between 1994 and 2004 when David was there buying those things at the grocery store. So what happened from the outside? Visibly, nothing. Nothing happened. The visiting teachers, which are basically people who are assigned to visit you from your ward, they would go knock, they would go try and visit. They would just never have the door answered. Marie, Laura's grandmother, would leave gifts for birthdays and Christmas and other holidays, and David would just kick them off of the porch, and Marie would go pick them up eventually. So Marie and Ken and Doug Sakota were Lorraine's family, and they were getting concerned. And so they asked the police about doing a welfare check. They were told that they could only request a welfare check every 3 to 4 years. So 3 years later, in 1997, the police went for their first welfare check. They knocked at the door, and nobody answered. They knocked again. Nobody answered. So then they knocked at the door and they said, if somebody does not come to the door, we are going to break the door down. And to the door came Laura and Lorraine. And they said, we're adults. We're choosing to live this way. This is what we want to do. And so the police had nothing that they could do. They weren't doing anything technically illegal. The police went in to verify that they had food, water, and electricity, and they left. And then 4 years later, in 2001, it was time for another welfare check. The police knocked at the door. Nobody answered. They knocked at the door again. Nobody answered. And then they finally said, we're going to break down this door if you don't come to the door soon. Well, they ended up having Lorraine and Laura come to the door just like before. And the same thing happened. We're adults. This is what we want. We're choosing this. There's nothing illegal. There's nothing wrong with us living this way. We're just practicing our religion. And so they ended up going in and checking for electricity, for water, and for food to verify that they had everything that they needed to live safe. Another 3 years would pass. And in 2004, police came to the door. They knocked. No one answered. They knocked again, announced that they were from the police department. No one answered. And then they said, if you don't answer this door, we're going to break it down. The difference this time was that outside at Marie's house, Doug and Marie were standing outside waiting to get a peek of Laura and Lorraine. They were standing there, and they had requested that this time the police bring the women out, and they would separate them and have them have psych evals separately this time. What ended up happening today was not what anybody expected, because when the police said, if you do not come to this door, we're going to break it down, this time, no one came to the door. So police called David Kaneko and said, we're at your house. Your wife and daughter are not answering the door, and we are going to be breaking it down. And David said, I'm on my way home. Please don't break it down. I'm on my way and I'll be there. Well, police were concerned that if they let David get there and they let him go in the house, that some sort of a hostage or dangerous situation would happen. So police did exactly what they said. They broke down the door. And this time they were hit by something that they never would have expected. See, when they had gone in the house before, it was pretty much a normal house. And in just 3 years, it had turned into a hoarder's den. There were boxes and trash and just things stacked up to the ceiling or up to shoulder level. There was an 18-inch path that police were able to walk single file line through the trailer by way of. And what they ended up finding was shocking. They walk in and they start to notice a strange smell. It smells like ammonia, but there's a different edge to it. And they soon realize that there are thousands and thousands of air fresheners everywhere. And they realize that, okay, there's a floral scent to this ammonia smell. So they are going around the house. They're yelling for Laura and Lorraine, and they're telling them, please come out. We need to see you. And the women just weren't coming. And so the police finally made it back to a bedroom. And on this bedroom, inside this bedroom, there was a bed with a teal blanket, and they could see one of the women was hiding under the blanket. So Detective Stoddard walked up to that blanket and he said, I need you to put your hands up. I need to see your hands. And the woman did not put her hands up. And so he pulled back the blanket and he gasped, oh dear. And one of the other officers said, dead body? And he said, oh yeah. See, they knew where one of the women was now, but they needed to find the other, and they needed to find her stat. So they end up looking around the house. Nobody's finding her anywhere. And then they notice a small lump laying on the other side of the bed. And they pulled back the blanket on both sides, and the bodies of Lorraine and Laura were in this bed together. So that was quite the unexpected visit for the police. Lots of those police talk about how they still have PTSD from seeing air fresheners now because of how intense this experience was. David soon arrived at the location, and he was arrested for obstruction of an officer for not telling the police about what he knew was going on inside. And he also was held on a material witness bond. Now, a material witness bond is something that makes it so that police are able to keep somebody because they have evidence, and so they are the evidence. So they were able to keep him in jail for a period of time. But it had definitely become apparent that David had been living with the bodies of Lorraine and Laura for years. It gives a whole new meaning to you, David. So the police found $11,000 stored in the house. They found that there was $400,000 in the bank. And so his bond was set at $500,000, which is the equivalent of over $1 million today. So he was held while the police searched for evidence. This was an all hands on deck situation. Every secretary, every officer, every county worker was given hazmat suits, and they went in and they meticulously documented every single thing in this house. They documented thousands of sheets of paper. They documented hundreds of broken down cereal boxes with dates meticulously written on them. They documented trash. They documented rotting food, which is so bizarre considering this situation. And they also found lots of candy wrappers, Jolly Ranchers specifically, with dates written on them. Just so many bizarre things. So as they were looking at this mess, detectives in teeny tiny Rexburg, Idaho in 2004, they were not sure what to do. And so Sheriff Klingler and Detective Travis Williams, they realized that they needed to find experts to help them figure out what to do about this situation. They realized that there were going to be 3 types of evidence. Evidence 1, the stuff. Evidence 2, the women's bodies. And evidence 3, David himself. So, evidence 1, the stuff. They knew that they were going to need an FBI profiler to be able to dig into this and kind of figure out the psychology and what was really going on here, because they found thousands and thousands of pages of journal entries, meticulous, teeny tiny journal entries. Every time they heard the heater go off, they were tracking that. How many magpies were in the yard? They were tracking that. The weather, the Utah Jazz scores, any meticulous thing that there was to track, Lorraine, the mother, she was tracking it. Meanwhile, Laura, she was writing extremely religious writings, and it became apparent that she was extremely obsessed with someone, and that would be relevant. Well, here's the problem, though. They needed to get this all sorted out quickly before that material witness bond was up and David would be free and they might lose him forever. And the wait list for an FBI profiler at this time was at least a year long. They didn't know what to do about this situation. So they were talking to the FBI, and the FBI said, now, we can't get you an FBI profiler, but this is such a strange case that we want to have you actually fly to Alaska and present this case at an FBI profiler conference. So you won't just have an FBI profiler, you will have every FBI profiler. So they go to this FBI profiler convention, and they meet Special Agent Amelia. And there are thousands of pieces of paper that Special Agent Amelia starts to go through in these journals. And she discovers that Laura, the daughter, she had a crush on a guy named Kevin. Now, Kevin was a boy that she went to high school with. She was involved in the same church. They knew each other really well. And it started out as just regular entries, talking about this cute boy, Kevin, that she liked. But it quickly became extremely obsessive. She talked about standing in the shadows at the school, and she was watching him, and she was noticing the pace of his breathing, and she would match his breathing, watching him from a distance. She would talk about how he was such a good guy when she was there, but he was even better when he didn't know that she was watching. Kevin, it turned out, according to her visions and her revelations, would be the prophet when Jesus came again, and she had been foreordained to become Kevin's wife. We'll talk about what foreordination means a little bit later. So Kevin, he goes on a mission to France, and while he's in France, Laura, she has visions of her friend Scott, who had died of cystic fibrosis, of Jesus Christ, and of her and Kevin's future spirit children going to visit Kevin and tell him about this mission, that he was to be the prophet when Jesus returned, and he needed to marry her. So imagine her surprise when it turns out that she received an invitation for his wedding to someone else after he got home from his mission. It's at this point that she realized that the only reason he would have married someone else was because she was wicked. because she had done something wrong. And it was time for her to go into purification through fasting, through study, through prayer, through reading her scriptures and becoming a more diligent Mormon, honestly. So she starts fasting, which is a practice within Mormonism. You start by fasting for 24 hours once a month. And that's probably where she began. But the act of fasting is for sanctification and purification, which we know that she wrote about. And she had lots of other religious writings about how she was wicked, how she knew that she was being punished. And she needed to take this further and further and further to become righteous enough because of what she was foreordained to do. So Laura and Lorraine, they ended up reading the Bible, and they found biblical teachings about what to eat. And so they stopped eating beef and pork and other things that are forbidden in the Bible. So they ended up also tracking every single thing they ate. They wrote meticulous, detailed journal entries about every single thing they ate. And they wrote those dates on those wrappers. They wrote the dates on the cereal boxes. They wrote the dates on everything to make sure that they were diligently following what they believed was this religious command from God for them to do this. Well, also in the journals from Lorraine, the mom, she mentioned things like she called David a wisp. She also called him a murderer. And she said that he needs to be zapped, which I believe is a reference to a character from the Book of Mormon, Nephi. His brothers were coming at him and he held out his hand, and with the power of God, they were thrust to the ground because they were zapped, is pretty frequently the phrasing that's used in Mormonism to describe them being shocked by the power of God. So she mentioned that David needed zapped. I'm guessing because he was so wicked, unlike her and Laura. So anyway, Agent O'Melia, the FBI profiler, she reads this and she posthumously diagnoses Laura with schizoaffective disorder, bipolar type. And this meant that she was having hallucinations, psychosis, paranoia. And the sad thing is, it could have been treated. None of this needed to happen. Now, evidence number 2. The bodies. So there's the Idaho coroner who initially took the bodies of Laura and Lorraine. Now remember, their bodies had been there for what seemed to be years. And he was able to take those bodies. He did an autopsy and he said that they died of sickness and starvation. Well, they needed to prove for sure that it was not murder, considering what Lorraine wrote in the journals. And so police called in forensic pathologist, Dr. William Rodriguez. Now, Dr. Rodriguez, he was extremely high up in the government as far as forensic pathology goes. He was the one who did the autopsies on Saddam Hussein's sons. And he went and he conducted his autopsies, and the results were sickness and starvation. Now, there were some things that also led them to feel that this might be the case. There were towels between the legs of Laura and Lorraine. And this is something that's seen in starvation cases because the loss of weight is so significant that bone resting on bone becomes so painful that people start putting things between their legs to help with that pain. They also had headbands and a sputum dish next to one of them, and they had been sick for sure. So it turned out, according to these autopsies, that Laura had died about 18 months before Lorraine. She had died in warm months, and Lorraine died in cold months. That's about all that they got from those, except one of the craziest parts of this is that these women's bodies had not decomposed as expected. Their bodies were partially mummified. So, evidence number 3, David. David was arrested, and the next day he said to police, "I want to talk." And police were like, "Yes, thank goodness, right? He's going to come talk to us." Now, police go into the interrogation room, and they start talking to him. And to their dismay, David was not concerned about his wife and daughter. He was not concerned about their bodies. He was not concerned about them. He was concerned about the fact that people were in his house going through his things. That's right. There are bodies that were just recovered from his house, and he is more concerned about the stuff in his house than his wife and daughter. So he was refusing to actually cooperate with police and tell them anything. And so there was a court order that overrode the patient-therapist privilege, and they were able to get the story from David's therapist, court-ordered therapist, about what happened. And David's story would align with the evidence. So here was David's story. They started to go into seclusion, and at first, things were, somewhat what you would have expected. They were out in the house. They were still eating. They were still living, just in the house all the time. And eventually their fear and hatred and detestation for David grew so immensely that anytime David was home, Laura and Lorraine were hiding in the bedroom where their bodies were found. They were fasting and praying. They believed this vision that Laura was supposed to be the prophet's wife when Jesus came again. So they were doing everything they needed to do to purify themselves to ensure this. David said that eventually the time came where he rarely saw them. They were just never coming out of the room. And so in summer 2001, he goes over and he opens the door to check, and he sees Lorraine standing over Laura's body, and Laura is obviously deceased. And Lorraine is reading scriptures, and she is insistent that this is part of the plan and that Laura will be coming back to life. And so he says that he just believed it. He believed that Lorraine would get Laura to come back to life. But Lorraine stayed in that room with Laura's body for months. She stayed there, and she would barely eat. David couldn't get her to come out and do anything. And it's during this period that Lorraine actually wrote and called David a murderer in her journal. We don't know whether this is like a psychological murder, but there was no physical evidence that Laura had been murdered. So Laura's dead, and then about 18 months pass, and Lorraine dies laying on the floor in that room. David goes into the room. He sees Lorraine laying there. He picks her up, and he puts her in bed next to Laura. He throws the blanket over them, and then he shuts the door to that bedroom and goes and buys lots of air fresheners, just like he did all the way through 2004. So this was a very, very bizarre case. So there's no way to prove murder. And detectives and Lorraine's family, they both have indicated that they believe very much that there may have been more involvement of David, but it was never able to be proved. They knew that he wasn't mentally well, but the question became, was he mentally unwell enough to not know that what he had done was wrong? Would he be able to get away with basically no punishment for what happened to Lorraine and Laura? See, here's some crazy things that David did while he was able to just live with their bodies. So first off, he's going and he's buying air box fans, he's buying air purifiers, he's buying air fresheners, he's buying all sorts of things to deal with the fact that he knows that their bodies are going to be decomposing. That's not something that you do if you believe that somebody's going to be coming back to life. At least I wouldn't think so. He also took himself to the doctor for pink eye. That's right, he was able to take himself to the doctor for pink eye, but his wife and daughter literally died They literally died, and he did nothing about it. Absolutely nothing. He went and he got knee surgery. He continued to work on his career. He reached, the top security clearance at Idaho National Laboratories. He showed up for work every day. He paid the bills. He bought himself groceries. He did all of these things, but he couldn't make sure that his literally dead wife and dead daughter were given a burial. He couldn't do that. And so the problem was that with no physical evidence, there was no way to pin him with anything significant. He was sentenced to 5 years of probation, and he had to spend 6 months in a mental health facility. So he got out of that mental health facility. He moved the trailer that his wife and daughter had died in and their bodies had stayed in for a year and a half and 3 years. And he moved that very same trailer down to a town south of Rexburg, where he lived until 2016 when he died of cancer. And today he is buried next to Lorraine and Laura in the Rexburg Cemetery. On their headstone, you'll see the words, "the three of them together." The eerie thing about this is that this is actually from a writing of Laura's, where she used the phrase, "the three of us together." So here's the thing. When I told this story on TikTok, people were pretty mad because what does this have to do with Mormonism? See, these are just mentally ill people and there's no Mormon foundations for the story, right? Well, while I think we all can agree that 99.99999% of Mormons don't end up going down this path, the reality is that there are a phenomenal number of Mormons who do face mental illness and do have those struggles. And so they are going to have some of these problems, but maybe just to less traumatic, less horrific degrees, but it is happening. And it's not just Mormonism. It does happen in every religion, for sure. So there's a couple words that I want to discuss real quick. One is religiosity. Oxford Dictionary defines it as strong religious feeling or belief. And religiosity, they definitely had some strong religious belief. Can we agree? For sure. The second word is scrupulosity. Now, NIH defines it as a psychological disorder primarily characterized by pathological guilt or obsession associated with moral or religious issues that is often accompanied by compulsive moral or religious observance, which I think we can agree they had, and is highly distressing and maladaptive. This is definitely maladaptive. In Mormonism, I want you to just think about the fact that the mainstream church is called the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. By its very name, it is a doomsday church. It is a church that is about the end of the world. It is a church that is focused on the latter days, right before Christ will come again. And so they took that religiosity and they took that scrupulosity and took that belief about the end of the world and just took it to the next level, or next 10 levels, if we're being honest. Additionally, in Mormonism, there's a concept called the mantle of authority. Now, the mantle of authority is the concept that there are people who they are authorities over you. According to Mormonism, David would have been an authority over Lorraine, and David would have been an authority over Laura. The mantle is far, far greater than the intellect is a notorious talk from the LDS Church that talks about how it doesn't matter what you think, it matters what the authority figures above you think. And this had come out before this whole thing went down. And so I do believe that there is something to be said for the fact that Lorraine and Laura believed completely to their core that David had a mantle of authority over them. And so if he was having visions about the end of the world, and if he was having visions and validating and verifying the hallucinations that Laura was having, they needed to submit to his authority. Additionally, this case happened in Rexburg, Idaho, which has the most Mormons per capita in the entire world. At this point, or in 2007, when I heard about this, the population, it was 97% LDS in Rexburg. So, of course, there's an LDS influence on this case that happened in Rexburg. There's also an LDS influence because of the theology of personal revelation. Now, personal revelation, the Mormon Church began with a personal revelation. Joseph Smith claims that he went into the sacred grove and he prayed about whether any of the churches were true, and God and Jesus themselves came down and told him that none of the churches were true and he needed to start his own. That is the party line. And so if David believed in this version of God, if he believed that the Mormon Church was getting things wrong, it's completely within the theology for him to have his own personal revelation. It's perfectly within the theology for Laura to have her own personal revelation. And that's what they believed was happening. Also, here's the thing is that when it comes to personal revelation, people will say, I've gotten this comment as well 1,000 times. People say that they would have known, that they would have had, the Spirit would have told them, they would have used the gift of discernment, and they would have known not to go down this path. And so people don't worry about themselves ending up in a similar place as the Kanekos. Well, the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints in 2014, they put out a list of 7 ways of how to know if the personal revelation that you are getting is from God or not. These are those 7 things. Step 1, notice the Spirit. Notice, do you feel the Spirit? Step 2, be guided. I think that the Kanekos thought that they were being guided. Step 3, seek diligently. You can't convince me that they weren't seeking diligently. Step 4, see how you feel. Well, they felt like they needed to go harder. Step 5, open your heart and your mind. Well, they were fasting and they were praying and they were studying to be able to do exactly that. Step 6, act on it. Oh, Lordy, did they act on it. Step 7, learn how the Spirit speaks to you. And that's exactly what they thought they were doing. You can never convince me in a million years that with what the Kanekos were doing, that they didn't meet these 7 items on this checklist. They had sticky notes with scriptures. They had a scripture, mine house is a house of order surrounded by a hoarder's nest. But they were so caught in that self-hatred and that scrupulosity. Also, foreordination, I mentioned this earlier. So there was a movie called Saturday's Warriors that it wasn't put out by the Mormon Church, but it was a big Mormon movie. Like everybody saw it back in the 90s. It came out in 1989, and it talked about a theology that is actually a Mormon theology. It's not just the movie, called foreordination, that in the premortal existence, you were assigned tasks and you have come here to this world and it's your job to see those tasks through. And 100% Laura believed that she had been foreordained to marry someone, just like the boy and the girl in Saturday's Warrior, who had made a commitment in the premortal existence that they would find each other and they would get married. So friends, that is the story of the Rexburg Mummies, the Kaneko family. So will you commit to like, rate, review, subscribe, or comment on your platform of choice so that the mayor of Kolob can feel really happy in his heart? I'd really appreciate that. And that way you'll get notified next time we come together to discuss another Mormon true crime.